The Bundeswehr is Germany's army and is once again the talk of the town for various reasons. But what actually makes the Bundeswehr so special and why are there so many misconceptions about it?
Welcome to YD. Why do Germans do things the way they do?
We need to go back in history a little, but only as far as Napoleon. At that time, the princes had standing armies of well-trained soldiers for linear tactics in which armies faced each other in lines and fired volleys at each other with their muskets. After the French Revolution, France quickly needed new soldiers and introduced the first conscription with the levée en masse. When Napoleon conquered Europe, or rather the European mainland, he occupied Prussia and decreed that Prussia was no longer allowed to have so many soldiers, from 235,000 before the war to only 42,000 after the Peace of Tilsit. He feared that they would rebuild a strong army to liberate themselves. This massive loss of land, power, and independence led to radical change in Prussia, the Prussian reforms which affected the entire state. However, we will limit ourselves here to a few important ones that affected the army. The army reformers, Karl von Clausewitz, August Neidhart von Gneisenau, Hermann von Boyen, and Gerhard von Scharnhorst, turned the Prussian army upside down. This began with the understanding that war should be a continuation of politics by other means, but then affected the entire population through the definition of various strategies and tactics, through the training of officers, where it was no longer nobility but ability what was decisive, to the point where conscription was introduced for all men who, however, only remained in the army for a short time. In the Krümper system, according to Scharnhorst, a few soldiers per unit were given leave, and the same number of recruits were recruited, but they were discharged after 1 to 2 months, so just after completing the basic training. These discharged soldiers, known as Krümper, often continued to train together in local Schützenverein, marksman guilds. This created a strong reserve force alongside the actual army, which grew to 65,000 soldiers during the Wars of Liberation in 1813. There was a new disciplinary law without corporal punishment and various other regulations. If it was a patriotic duty and honor to serve in the army, soldiers should be treated with respect and, if necessary, placed under arrest but no longer beaten. After 1813, universal conscription was also introduced in Prussia. We skip 100 years and come to the end of the First World War. The German Empire, which included Prussia and all other German territories such as Saxony, Bavaria, etc., was only allowed to have an army of 100,000 men. And to prevent circumvention, as had been the case in Prussia, soldiers were generally required to remain in the army for at least 12 years, and thus became a professional army again. This army of the first democratic German state was the Reichswehr. In order to recruit the best soldiers, the assessment center was invented and introduced for officers' cadets. Anyone who wanted to become an officer had to pass the relevant exams. However, the soldiers themselves did not have the right to vote. To a certain extent, this led to the Reichswehr being regarded in parts as a state in a state. Many officers were still attached to the monarchy and did not necessarily support the democratic government. In 1918, the Ebert-Groener Pact had placed the Supreme Army Command under the authority of the Reichspräsident, and thus the army supported the government against communist attempts at revolution, but the army subsequently enjoyed a certain degree of independence that excluded soldiers from general jurisdiction. Many of the soldiers who had fought in First World War joined Freikorps groups due to a lack of work. These groups existed among both communists and nationalists depending on their political orientation. There were also a Black Reichswehr, which was often deployed internally, particularly in the Eastern Territories against militant Freikorps groups. Its existence was officially denied. After Hitler seized power, he circumvented the restriction of the Treaty of Versailles with Russia's help, rebuilt the air force and armored forces, and reintroduced conscription. The soldiers were now sworn to Hitler himself as they had previously been to the monarchs. The well-trained soldiers of the Reichswehr formed the core of the new Wehrmacht, into which conscripts were also drafted. In addition, there was a Schutzstaffel SS founded in 1922 as a thug squad, which was then expanded to the Waffen-SS, which included both combat troops and concentration camp guards. At first, only volunteers served in the SS, but later conscripts from the conquered territories were also forced into service. After the end of Second World War, Germany was disarmed and its armed forces were disbanded in 1946. Well, there was a German mine clearance service that was supposed to clear sea mines in the North Sea and Baltic Sea. Some former German prisoners of war of the Western Allies, or disarmed armed forces, who were referred to as disarmed enemy forces or separated enemy personnel, were conscripted into service groups and assisted in the reconstruction or destruction of ammunition. Many Germans were repulsed by the Prussian militarism of the past, and until 1949, when the new Federal Republic was founded, Germany had no armed forces of its own. After 1949, the Knetztruppe was secretly formed. So once again, Germany resorted to trickery to get around the regulation on armed forces. This Knetztruppe, named after Albert Schnetz, brought together former officers of the Wehrmacht and SS and planned how to respond to a possible attack by the Soviet Union or a communist uprising within Germany. As I have shown here, there was a communist party in the German Bundestag until 1956. Unlike previous tricks in Prussia over the Black Reichswehr, however, this group was not controlled by the state. Konrad Adenauer probably learned of its existence in 1951. The majority of Germans did not want rearmament. The wars of the previous 50 years had caused much suffering, and the reputation of the Germans had been ruined by Nazi Germany. In addition, the Germans hoped that reunification with the Soviet-occupied zone would soon be possible and therefore did not want to have an army that would stand in the way of this. At the same time, however, the Cold War between East and West was intensifying. NATO was founded in April 1949. It was clear to the NATO allies that any conflict with the Warsaw Pact would be fought on German soil. They assumed that the Warsaw Pact would attack from the GDR and planned their defense with massive battles on the territory of the Federal Republic of Germany. The main defense was to take place on the Rhine. In the GDR, there were paramilitary organizations such as the Deutsche Grenzpolizei, German border police from 1946, the Kasernierte Volkspolizei, Barrack People's Police from 1948, and the Betriebskampfgruppen, workplace combat groups, from 1953. On May 1950, General Gerhard Graf von Schwerin became advisor on technical security issues to the Federal Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. In June 1950, the Korean War broke out and there were fears of similar conflict on German soil. On 9 October, 15 former Wehrmacht officers met at Himmelroth Abbey on the instruction of Konrad Adenauer to discuss West German armed forces that could be established in line with the wishes of the Western Allies. At that time, the Soviet armed forces had stationed around 328,000 soldiers in the GDR, while the Western Allies still had around 170,000 soldiers in West Germany. The Western troops were therefore conventionally inferior, and the most populous Western European state, the Federal Republic of Germany, was still demilitarized. However, neither the German nor the European population wanted to see Germany remilitarized. In the GDR, this was justified as necessary by means of propaganda against the class enemy, with Western Germany being portrayed as a successor to the Nazis. The Himmelroth Memorandum set out various points for new armed forces, from the questionable treatment of Second World War veterans to planned troop strength and alignment with the Western Allies, to a fifth point, the Innere Gefüge, internal structure, which we will discuss later. On 26 October 1950, an Amt Blank office, was established to cooperate with Western Allies on military matters. In 1951, at the insistence of the Allies, a special police force was established in Germany, the Bundesgrenzschutz, Federal Border Guard, which retained combatant status until 1994 and was heavily armed even for European police force, similar to the paramilitary units of the GDR. NATO recognized that the GDR was preparing for a possible war with local troops and did not want to leave West Germany's potential untapped. On 23rd January 1951, the then Commander-in-Chief of NATO forces, Dwight D. Eisenhower, issued a declaration of honor stating that German soldiers had fought bravely in the Second World War and, with a few exceptions, had not lost their honor. In December 1952, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer said the same thing in the Bundestag. This made it possible to reintegrate former members of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, provided that, well, no war crimes had been proven against them. While the Allies had initially documented war crimes with great enthusiasm and hunted down those responsible, their commitment waned and some acts were increasingly overlooked. But that is another topic. On 5th May 1955, the armed forces were established. On 7th June, the military administration was set up, and on 12th November, the first 101 volunteers were sworn in. The armed forces, which were still nameless at the time, were named the Bundeswehr on 1st April 1956. The intention was to succeed the first democratic armed forces during Weimar Republic, the former Reichswehr. The term Wehrmacht was deliberately no longer used. While it had started with volunteers, conscription for men aged 18 and over was introduced in 1956. In the beginning, much of the equipment came from the USA, especially aircraft and tanks. The type of training was similar but also went further. Two things were important in training. From a military point of view, every soldier was trained to be able to replace his superior, in the case of officers, up to 2 levels above him. The background to this was a numerical superior of the Warsaw Pact forces, which they wanted to counter with well-trained soldiers who could make decisions independently, even if their superior was unavailable. The second important point was Innere Führung, inner leadership, the soldier's self-image as a citizen in uniform. In contrast to the Reichswehr, soldiers retained the right to vote or to be elected. How could one explain to a soldier that he had to defend a country and a government that he was not allowed to vote for? The aim was to prevent the creation of a state within state. In addition to expanding the armed forces and training a large reserve, conscription was also intended to ensure that all men came into contact with the Bundeswehr and therefore all families. All Germans were to have direct or indirect insight into the Bundeswehr. Furthermore, the rights and duties of a soldier were made clear during basic training, which orders must be carried out and which orders must not be carried out. What are war crimes and what and who is protected by the Geneva Conventions. The aim was to prevent soldiers from using the excuse, "I was only following orders." There were also trusted representatives of enlisted personnel and non-commissioned officers in the companies and of officers in the battalions. There was a parliamentary commissioner, Wehrbeauftragter, for the armed forces in the Bundestag, to whom soldiers could turn, and soldiers had the right to complain. At the same time, conscription meant that the public always had an eye on the Bundeswehr. There were always parents or siblings who noticed when a soldier was being mistreated, and the press was quickly informed. It was legally stipulated that the Bundeswehr could not be deployed domestically and could only provide assistance upon request, for example in the event of disasters such as the floods in Hamburg on the Oder or the Ahr Valley. In the following years, other things were also introduced, such as the Berufsförderungsdienst, vocational promotion service. The big problem for professional soldiers after the Second World War, who were initially excluded from public service because of possible war crimes, was that they no longer had a job and did not have good civilian professional qualifications. I have talked here about the dual vocational training system. If temporary soldiers had learned to be good soldiers but then returned to civilian life after their service, what were they supposed to work for? Being a mercenary is illegal in Germany. The Berufsförderungsdienst enables temporary soldiers to undertake valuable further training in civilian occupation during or at the end of their service, so that they can complete an apprenticeship after 4, 8 or 12 years of service. When they leave the Bundeswehr, they are well trained in a civilian profession. Even conscripts could undertake additional training or have private evening classes paid for. There was also the option of conscientious Objection, which was rather the exception until the end of the 1960s. From 1961 onwards, it was also possible to do community service instead of military service. Or you could sign up for 12 years within an aid organization, volunteer fire brigade, technical relief organization, or similar. There is a whole playlist on this topic. The tactics and equipment of the German armed forces are typical for Western armed forces and designed to ensure the survivability of soldiers. As numerous reports on the war in Ukraine have shown, since the days of the Soviet Union, equipment and tactics have been designed for massive numerical superiority, in which the individual was unimportant. Tanks were mass-produced and not designed for quick repairs because it was clear that most of them would be destroyed. Western tanks are designed for quick repair and good protection on the crew, as it was assumed that they would be outnumbered, so the equipment and soldiers had to be operational for as long as possible. The Bundeswehr is, by definition, a defensive army protecting Germany and its allies, which is also reflected in its equipment. The Leopard tank has a fast reverse gear to change position backwards in defense, which Russian tanks do not have, as they are only designed for attack. The helicopters were anti-tank helicopters equipped only with anti-tank guided missiles and not with onboard cannon, as found on the Apache, for example. The French model of the Tiger is therefore constructed differently from the German model. The submarines are only designed for coastal defense at the North Sea and Baltic Sea and not for long voyages across the ocean like nuclear submarines. What many people do not know about modern armed forces is that for every soldier in the front line, there are 3 to 4 others supporting them, whether with supplying material, repair equipment, providing medical service, establishing radio communication, building accommodation, or more generally, performing administrative tasks. After unification, the National People's Army of the GDR was incorporated into the Bundeswehr. The strength of the armed forces fluctuated from around 250,000 soldiers at the beginning to around 500,000 soldiers in the 1980s to just under 200,000 soldiers today. The duration of compulsory military service also fluctuated from initially 12 months to 18 months in the 1960s and 70s, and finally to 6 months before it was suspended in 2011. Until 2011, the Bundeswehr consisted of professional soldiers, temporary soldiers who served between 2 and 20 years, and conscripts. In addition, there was always a certain proportion of reservists. In 2011, conscription was suspended, meaning that no more age groups were drafted. It was assumed that the future would be more peaceful and that the Bundeswehr task would lie more in foreign missions to secure peace and support reconstruction in other countries. Tank battalions and other combat troops were disbanded and lighter troop formations were established that could be deployed more quickly. Since the Bundeswehr is designed as a defensive army, it was possible to transport tanks by rail, but this only works within Europe and not when deployed in Africa or Afghanistan. In 2011, people wondered whether homeland and alliance defense would still play a role at all, because countries that had been part of the former Warsaw Pact, such as Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states, were now also members of NATO. 3 years later, Russia annexed Crimea, and after Russia's invasion of the Ukraine in 2022, Russia's other neighbors, such as Finland and Sweden, also joined NATO for fear of Russian aggression. While Germany's defense budget in the years since 2000 has been around 1.2 to 1.5% of gross domestic product, the Bundeswehr has repeatedly struggled with lack of equipment, which is nothing new for German soldiers since the First World War. Unlike in other countries, however, the Bundeswehr or the Ministry of Defense was not a particularly popular topic, and for politicians, the position of defense minister often became a hot seat. In fact, the current defense minister, Boris Pistorius, is the first popular minister in a long time. A special fund was also approved to bring the Bundeswehr up to date in terms of equipment. Recently, conscription has been brought back into play in various ways. While it was normal to join the Bundeswehr in the 1960s and more young men did civil service from the 1970s onwards, there is now considerably resistance to the idea that young men could be conscripted into compulsory service again. In my opinion, the suspension of compulsory military service was a big mistake. I myself was initially a conscript and then became a temporary soldier. I would not have become one if I had not had to try out the Bundeswehr first. Compulsory military service was also a good way to recruit good young talents. During that time, you could see how good the person was in terms of personality, character, athleticism, or other qualities. Ultimately, the armed forces had to compete with well-paid civilian jobs that offer more free time and fewer foreign deployments. Now it seems that in future all 18-year-olds will receive a questionnaire for conscription, which men must fill out and women can fill out. If enough volunteers subsequently join the armed forces, nothing else will happen. However, it is not yet certain what will happen if there are not enough volunteers. There's also a kind of trade union for the Bundeswehr, only in a manner of speaking, because soldiers are civil servants, at least for the limited period, and are not allowed to strike. The Deutscher BundeswehrVerband, German Bundeswehr Association, is legally a registered association with over 200,000 members. However, the Bundeswehrverband also represents Bundeswehr soldiers, particularly in relation to politics and in matters of pension law. While women have been able to become soldiers in almost all areas for decades, they are not subject to compulsory military service. People sometimes ask why only men are conscripted for military service and not women. The simple and historical reason is that numerous women, but only a few men, are needed for reconstruction of the population. However, if this were disregarded, the basic law would have to be amended so that women could also be conscripted. Another issue has brought the Bundeswehr into the headlines, namely incidents involving a paratroopers unit in Saarbrücken. It is said to deal with sexual assault, drugs, and right-wing extremism. While all armies take action against drug abuse and sexual assault, the Bundeswehr has always taken actions against all forms of right-wing extremism, and indeed has done so throughout its history. In 2024 alone, 97 members of the Bundeswehr were dismissed for right-wing extremism. The Bundeswehr has clearly positioned itself behind the rule and law of the free democratic basic order, precisely because soldiers are citizens in uniform and at the same time temporary civil servants. They uphold the basic law according to which human dignity is inviolable. Anyone who does not adhere to the basic law is therefore dismissed. This is not about voting for a particular party, but about the behavior of soldiers both on and off duty, because even when misconduct occurs outside of working hours, Bundeswehr soldiers are bound by a special relationship of loyalty. Let's see what the future brings. Remarks, additions, and comments in the comments. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next video.